Good morning. Hi, good morning, councillors, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming to this, our 10th anniversary of the Dublin Economic Monitor Event this morning. My name is Juliette Passmore and I'm an economist with Dublin City Council. We have a short but full agenda this morning, starting with an overview of what the Dublin Economic Monitor is telling us this quarter, followed by a fireside chat looking back over the last 10 years, and then we'll get some insights into spending trends that MasterCard are seeing. And finally, Fingal Chief Executive Anne-Marie Farrelly will close proceedings. But first, I'd like to invite Councillor Janet Horner, representing the Lord Mayor of Dublin, to say a few words.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much for having me here this morning. I'm here on behalf of Lord Mayor Emma Blaine. I'm wearing the Sheriff's chain this morning. I always feel the need to explain the chain because sometimes people think it's just jewellery, but it is in fact the chain of office of Dublin City Council, and one of the lesser worn ones, because we have the Lord Mayor's chains, the Deputy Lord Mayor's chains, and then the Sheriff's chains, which are very historic, but maybe not quite as regal maybe as some of the other chains are. Thank you so much for having me here. This is particularly special because it marks the 10th anniversary of the Dublin Economic Monitor. It was 10 years ago that this project began, when Dublin City Council recognised that there was no dedicated source of data specifically tracking the economy of Dublin. This led to 4 Dublin local authorities coming together, and the concept of the Dublin Economic Monitor was born. Over the past decade, the data has evolved and become more frequent. Sometimes that is particularly important in times of crisis. We will hear more about this shortly when 2 of those who were here at the beginning share their reflections and insights. 10 years ago, the global economy was emerging from a very turbulent period. For Ireland, the challenges were particularly severe. Ireland's credit rating plummeted and 10 years borrowing rates or yields soared. Austerity dominated the national conversation. Fast forward to today, and government 10-year borrowing costs are just under 3%, which is close to that of Germany and France. As a nation, we have moved successfully from high risk to being viewed as a stable core European economy. But there are new challenges, with a shift in US trade policy has significant implications for Ireland's open economy. The Dublin Economic Monitor was created to provide transparency, offering up data, up-to-date, timely, relevant, accurate indicators charting the progress of Dublin's economy. And in this age of mis and disinformation, the data-driven approach is more important than ever, not just for Dublin, but for Ireland. And particularly, I would say, as councillors, it is so important that we have reliable data for our city and for decision making. We are often been swayed by what newspaper columns are saying or what we are reading and hearing on social media, and data-driven policy is absolutely essential, and I really do think that having reliable data is so core to being able to ensure Dublin City Council is an effective organisation. So with that in mind, we are looking at broadening the scope of the retail spending data that Dublin has been getting to cover each local authority in Ireland. We have been working closely with the Local Government Management Agency on this, and we are excited about this project, which will allow us in local government to monitor spending data more frequently and focus on the impact of events and policy initiatives. More on this coming later in the year, but for today we do have the European economist from MasterCard to show us how the spending data can measure the impact of on global events on consumer activity in Ireland and in Europe and Ireland. But ahead of that, I would like to ask Andrew Webb, Chief Economist with Grant Thornton, to come up and share his insights on the current position of Dublin economy and what to watch for in the coming months. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Good morning, everyone. Really delighted to be in such fantastic surroundings. I think these surroundings really befit the grandeur of 10 years of the Dublin Economic Monitor, and I think we've a real success story to tell over that time in terms of where the monitor has gone and how it's evolved, and certainly the economy has given us plenty to think about and plenty to talk about over that period. For me, though, this morning, it's not a position of dwelling. It's one of looking where we are today and what that might mean for the economy as we move through the next number of months. So I want to set a little bit of the global context, then drill into Ireland's economy, and then obviously move towards what this latest edition of the Monitor is telling us. And I always say this, I won't tell you chapter and verse of what's in the monitor, because I really want you to go to dublineconomy.ie and read it there and spend some time dwelling and assessing the articles there. Really good website, rich information there. But that's the advert over. I dusted down my favourite chart. It was getting a bit settled in terms of uncertainty for a while there. I thought we were into a period of calm, but a certain president in the US has arrived for Trump 2.0, and so we're right now back into a particularly uncertain period in terms of global economics and socio-politics. Just to remind you, if you haven't seen this before, or for those that have, this is The Economist collecting articles and tracking the word uncertainty in the context of economic discussions and economic articles and that geopolitical context. So they track all that, they index it, and we can see that we're now well above where we were in the worst of the uncertainty around the Brexit period and trade tensions and the pandemic. And recent events then, like the war in Ukraine. So we're right up at the highest it's ever been, having had a period of relative calm. And as I said, there's a large part of that is driven by the presidency in the US. Now, I would just caveat this by saying that beware the use of AI. This cartoon was AI generated, and he is missing a finger on that hand. So that's a warning to us all not to become overly reliant on AI and to continue to use insights and humans. But just to talk a little bit around how the global economy is adapting to Trump, or having to adapt to Trump 2.0. It isn't just about tariffs, although it feels like it probably is almost all about tariffs, but there's a massive, big, beautiful bill, as he calls it, although Musk might disagree, moving through in the US, which could have significant impact on the US debt position, and that obviously has then implications across the wider global economy and where the US goes next. Lots then around regulation and deregulation, and that probably brings us into lots of ease of doing business in the US and climate deregulation and things like that. So that brings us to a lot of uncertainty and unpredictability. And then, as we're seeing in real time on the news currently, issues around immigration and mass deportations, and the Middle East front and center in the geopolitical space. So the wars and conflicts there really impacting on volatility and uncertainty in the wider energy markets, in the wider trade flows and the flow of containers and shipping and etc. And then protectionism, which I'd reiterate that we've talked about protectionism from a US perspective in the past, and not just in a Trump presidency. This is a move in the US to try to reset the relationship with the global economy, and we're seeing that writ large, obviously, in the tariff situation as we're experiencing it now. But this has been a trend that started before Trump and went through the Biden presidency, and he's probably just pressed the accelerator on it. Which brings me to this, and that's the it's the historical average tariff rate that the US imposes with its trading partners. And as we know, it has shot up in the very recent weeks. Now, still lots to negotiate in that, and there could be many deals done between now and the end of the year. But the forecast currently is that the average tariff rate will be about 22%. And as we know, in the Irish economy, so heavily reliant on exports, that could have significant impact if the EU deal doesn't come to pass, and that those tariffs could potentially get worse. And that led to a number of commentators really starting to think about the impact on the Irish economy. So, we had the thought from Dan O'Brien that it could hit harder in the long run than the 2010 bailout and the debt crisis. We've got from academia a view that the game might be up for Ireland in terms of the economic model that we've enjoyed the benefits of for so long. And then a political slant, very nuanced, a complex and significant challenge. So political speak, if ever there was some. But what does that start to mean then in terms of the global economy? Well, there's a real scramble to reforecast. So, all the various forecasters that we track from the OECD, IMF, EU, Oxford Economics, all of them have been very rapidly out reforecasting where they think the various markets are going to go and where the various economies are going to land over the next year or two. So there has been a downgrade in growth forecasts where it was previously 3.1% for 2025. That's down slightly to 2.9%. And then for 2026, down ever so slightly again from 3 to 2.9. Now those are very small shifts, but they do matter because you start to think, very small percentage point or fraction of a percentage point, but that's jobs, that's spend, and that's then, the contagion effect of that in terms of unemployment benefits have to go up, the tax take of the government changes then, et cetera, et cetera. So, it is, it looks like very small shifts, but it has a multiplier effect right the way through all of the economy. And then just to think about, okay, but if we were tracking on one line, what do all these potential differences mean? And this is where we've got from Oxford Economics. So they're running a range of scenarios currently in terms of what they think their baseline was in May, and then if the various trade negotiations don't go particularly well, or if they go better than expected. So in a worst case scenario, we're seeing a significant impact on GDP growth forecasts for 2026. In terms of the US, they're predicting a 6 percentage point difference downwards from where they thought the economy might go when they did it in May, and then a worst case scenario. And then the world economy, about a 2.5% dip in that worst case scenario. I would say their central forecast, though, is the one that they're still clinging to. So not quite all doom and gloom. There is some hope in the economy that the baseline will be the one that it lands on. And I suppose that's a point at which you say, with a Trump presidency, there's an awful lot of noise, and it's trying to pick the signal through that noise and then see where we actually go. And that's very uncertain still. Then just moving through some of the key indicators from a global context and how it impacts on us locally. The fast up, slow down, interest rate moves. Actually, I suppose the downturn in the ECB has gathered pace, and we're probably there or thereabouts in terms of where we're going to see that land. Maybe one more cut later in this year, but then a fairly settled interest rate environment over the next year and a half, 2 years. Those forecasts coming from ING, but would be consistent with the various consensus forecasts that we're seeing. So yeah, the ECB has moved at reasonable pace, and now we're seeing that probably settle after maybe one more cut later in the year, as I say. How's Ireland likely to fare in all of this? Then I suppose that it really does come down to what happens with tariffs and where we hit in terms of the settled deal. But if we think about a baseline scenario of 2.5% growth in modified domestic demand, so stripping out all that froth from the multinationals, if we then think about the tariff scenario, we could see a 0.5 percentage point downturn in growth in this year, and then next year maybe a 1 percentage point downturn in growth that was expected from a baseline. So it could be very impactful from an Irish economy perspective. But it would be remiss having I suppose given that sense of the concerns for the economy. Just in the last number of days, we did see the growth figures coming out for GDP, just to, I suppose, make the point firmly that, I prefer personally the modified domestic demand measure because it tells us a better picture of what's happening in the local economy. But the GDP figures are the ones that are published, and we see those, and they have surged over the first quarter of this year. So we're almost at 10% growth. Not surprisingly, a lot of front loading of exports to try and beat the tariff situation. So that was the key driver of that was the export growth. But we're seeing that phrase leprechaun economics coming back into play. So and the credibility of these GDP figures I've seen questioned in the media over the last number of days as well. So just bear that in mind when you see figures around, phenomenal growth and 10%, that there's a different story happening in the domestic economy. Again, and this is hopefully the last time I use this type of chart, because I do think we're seeing inflation move into the rearview mirror. I hope we've seen inflation move into the rear view, but there is a fear that there's maybe a little bit more of a sticky inflationary story in play. So, as I say, I hope we see this slide move off the deck for future editions. But for now, we're thinking inflation still very much in the watch list for us, and that projected inflation 3.6% in 25, 3.2% headline inflation in 26. So fingers crossed you don't see that slide again. In terms then, I've always been a real watcher of sentiment. I think that's such a good leading indicator of where the economy might go next. What are consumers thinking about? Where are they going to spend their money and deploy their hard-earned cash? Likewise, businesses, how's their sentiment? Because that for businesses means employing people, investing in capital expenditure, new kit, and all the positive benefits of that. So from a consumer sentiment perspective, the indicator there, 60.8 in May, slightly up. I think the pace at which things are moving in the media, so we had the tariff announcement, big shock, but then we saw a pullback in those threats, so an easing of those worries. But cost concerns continue, grocery bills rising, etc. So there's a fair bit to unpick in consumer sentiment in terms of where people are likely to go next. But just one other point I'll make on that is the general economic outlook has risen pretty at pace, from 12 in April right up to 19 now. Still well off where it was, a year or so ago, but just interesting that we're in such a febrile environment in terms of the media and the economy, but there's still hopefully some optimism and some upsides on the general economic view. And as I mentioned then, business activity, so the composite PMI index still in expansion mode. Anything above 50 is expansion, below 50 contraction. So, in solid 54 territory, 54.9. So, we're in expansion mode. New business and export business increased, as I said, trying to front load that tariff pain that might come. So a real injection of pace into trying to get orders out the door and across into the US, understandably. I would say, though, that that's becoming more subdued, and that, again, wouldn't be a surprise just as that washes through that early phase of the year. So then turning to the Dublin Monitor, and as I say, you'll have it in the documents that were on each of your seats. It's on dublineconomy.ie. But just some of the, I suppose, key indicators as I was flicking through it, just reflecting on what's happening in the Dublin economy. Employment, an employment record, so your really positive labour market, and that story has been consistent over the last number of years, is that there's been lots of employment created, lots of job postings, and a very healthy labour market environment. And certainly questions that we were facing, and when we did Fingal's economic strategy and their skills strategy, it was about where are the people coming from to service the demand. So, it was very much we're at full or very close to full employment. So, where do we solve this? I would say, though, that there's, for me, a little bit of a risk that that's softening now. I think fewer listings. Certainly from the Indeed postings, we're starting to see fewer listings. And then just on last week's unemployment figures, we're just seeing a very, very slight increase in unemployment rate of those 25 plus. So there's maybe just something maybe starting to happen or a turn. But, 1 month doesn't make a trend, so we'll keep very, very close to that in terms of seeing what's happening next. And then housing, the issue of our time. We're doing a lot of work with tourism at the minute, and we're speaking about how to increase tourism and how to increase bed spaces. And so often the pushback from people we're speaking to is, why would you be doing that when when housing's the issue? And we hear that time and again. So, housing is the issue, but transactions healthy, commencements really not. And I think I've said that probably several times before in fora like this. Is that problem just doesn't seem to be solving, and so we're not going to get that affordability issue resolved if we don't find a way to get those commencements up consistently and get those transactions at a nice steady pace. So just to start thinking about a closeout, the Dublin Economic Scorecard, there's a much broader one in the document, but I just focused on the economy element of that. So as I say, we're seeing good, solid indicators in this edition of the Economic Monitor. We're seeing very positives in the labour market, as I said. And then I'll not steal the thunder of any of the spending pulse type information, but really can't wait actually to hear that story. It's been a cornerstone of the Economic Monitor for so long, and that's certainly an indicator that we get a lot of value from. So I look forward to hearing that in due course. And then just when I was thinking about the scramble to reforecast, I typed into Google Ireland forecasts. As an economist, you don't really think that there's other types of forecasts out there, but often accused of being a pessimist, I thought I'd end on a positive note. So in the scramble to reforecast, even Met Éireann are getting in on the act, and they're predicting a heat wave over the rest of June. So fingers crossed for that. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the rest of the morning.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Certainly uncertain times, but as you say, a crumb of comfort in the weather forecast. Next up are two of the original architects of the Dublin Economic Monitor, and they'll talk a little about the journey of the last 10 years. Firstly, it's Jamie Cudden. He is Executive Manager with Dublin City Council, and second is Lorcan Blake, who is Director of Economic Advisory with Grant Thornton.
That's great. Thanks very much for that beautiful venue today. So yeah, it's been quite a journey the last 10 years, and I suppose my recollection of it was back 2014 when our chief executive at the time, Owen Keegan, handed me a memo. Now, Owen was very famous for his memos, and the memo had entitled a Dublin Economic Monitor and said, Jamie, here's my idea. I think, can you deliver it for me? And that was the start of it. And, I suppose we kind of identified the fact that there was no definitive source for data for our capital city in terms of economic performance, and a lot of the data was out of date, and we had to look back. It was very hard to kind of just see where we're at, and I guess that was the origins of it, and where we first intersected. I mean, can you remember back then, or is that too long ago, Lorcan?
I was a lot younger then and less grey. I won't put it all down to the Economic Monitor, but that's where it started. Absolutely, it was a single source of accessible data to bring everything together, because the likes of the CSO, the NTA, the RTB, all had great data sets, but they weren't really drawn together in one accessible place, and that's what we were looking to do from day one. We always had the scorecard, which we would like to think is one way we've made it more accessible. I think the Dublin Economy website, dublineconomy.ie, is another example of where we've tried to bring it together. But you're dead right, we started out, tried to cast the net as wide as we could in terms of pulling data together from those sources. I would call out S&P Global on the Purchasing Managers Index. They've been there since day one. CBRE as well have provided brilliant data on the commercial property market, which we've used as well. So they were there from the get-go, but we have evolved it massively over the years as well, Jamie. So we've brought on board MasterCard, obviously, who will speak today. STR Global on hotels, FDI Intelligence and foreign direct investment. We keep on spreading the net wider and wider, and that is something we'll look to do over the coming years as well, because data sets are the lifeblood of the monitor, really, and we are conscious that there are still gaps. So, for instance, sustainability is an area where we don't have it in the hard copy of the PDF at the present time. We are working hard on it because we're conscious there's more areas we'd like to cover, and there are different areas that are of great relevance to the Dublin economy and how it performs both at the moment and for the years ahead.
And I remember, some of the first conversations, and we worked really closely with the four Dublin local authorities on this. And I remember when we were ideating the first iteration of the monitor, yourself and I think John Lawler came in, and it was, I think the comment from the other local authorities was, it's a little bit bland. It looks a bit too much like a traditional kind of economic paper. Can we not make it more accessible? Do you remember that conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's always been a challenge. We don't want to make it too dense, so we try to break it up with articles, for instance, and again, to say thanks to so many contributors, to many in the room today who've written brilliant articles. But again, it's trying to cut out the jargon, keep it objective and accessible to as many people, be it residents, people working in Dublin, investing and so on. So that was part of the refresh which we undertook about 4 years ago now, to make it a little less dense, I guess, and more accessible for as many people as possible.
And I think the look and feel was key, and I think it was Karen Hess from an agency called Design 256, wasn't it?
Yeah, 256.
And at the start, she was like, "Why don't you make this one of the most beautiful economic monitors for a city in the world?" And that was the idea: have beautiful visuals of different iconic locations across the region, make it like just really nice and accessible, and have a digital presence. I think that was really important, where you as a economist or as a policymaker in Dublin, you just go to dublineconomy.ie and you can get your slides for a presentation, get your data. That's really important for us, wasn't it?
Oh, completely, yeah. And even this week we have a trade delegation into Grant Thornton from an American state, and this will definitely be on the table when they're in the room. And they're always interested in this document. They can see in 20 pages or less how Dublin is doing, what's going on in the economy, and it's really important for that audience, but also so many other audiences, the indigenous business base, people living and working in Dublin, visitors to Dublin, people considering investing in Dublin as well. So there's a really broad audience, and we're really conscious of trying to tick as many boxes as possible each quarter in terms of appealing to a broad church ultimately. I think we have 20 embassies represented today, and I just love the fact that this is picked up so well across so many different areas. And I think one area, I remember Juliet, we were talking, the school teacher came up to and said, "This is an amazing resource for teaching his business class," and I was like, "Oh, that's really inspiring," just to hear how people are using this information. And I think it's a great learning tool as well. But no, so it's definitely getting used. So that's really important. So we're 10 years. I mean, I suppose, at that first day, I didn't think you'd be here 10 years later, did you? I did it, geez. I did get out of my old job, but the monitor followed me. So it'll probably be at my funeral. It'll probably be mentioned at this stage. But no, it's been brilliant, and I absolutely love working on it. I think we've had some great contributions over the years. I know we were talking in the lead up to this about notable articles that have been written, and I think the pandemic period really stands out. It was obviously a desperate time for the country and for the world, but we also were able to track it in real time in the monitor, and had some interesting contributions from people speaking about the likes of how technology was adopted. And I think remote working and the likes has been one major change for office-based jobs in Dublin in the last decade. But also the likes of Chris Kane wrote an article asking, "Where is my office?" And I think that's a topic that many organisations are still wrangling with, including our own, as to how do you get people back to the office, and how is that going to affect everything from the commercial property market to retail to hospitality. So that was a really interesting period to focus on. And one of the other thing I'd mention is the labour market. When you think we started 10 years ago with an unemployment rate of about 9%, that's down to about 4.5% today. That's been a huge development, and I think skills, which Fingal have looked at in great detail, and all of the local authorities have looked at, is a challenge at the present time, but is a representation of how Dublin has evolved massively in the last decade.
I mean, we're always looking for contributors for the articles, so please get in touch if you have anything you think would be useful to add. We can put it on our digital channels. We can use it in the monitor itself. I think that's been something we've been really grateful for people taking the time to give those inputs and insights, haven't we? It's been amazing.
Yeah, completely, and I think it's to the credit of the local authorities for giving us the editorial freedom to be objective and present the facts, and it's the same with the contributors. I don't know if it's ever happened that someone's had to tone down their article or has been told or to change anything. It's and that's really to the benefit of the monitors, having that independent view and really diverse opinion. So again, if anybody in the room would like to contribute, we'd love to hear from you.
One of my favourite articles was, I think, VP for MasterCard, Chapin Flynn, where we looked at, I think working with Andrew and your team, looked at the economic impact of the American football games, where we were able to use a cut of spend data to look at the profile of spend. I thought that was like a real groundbreaking piece of work that we did over the period.
Yeah, and I know Ollie will speak to it later on, that really granular data, it all comes back to the data ultimately. If you can get really granular data down to, I think in that instance we nearly had it to the neighbourhood or to the postcode in Dublin, it's phenomenal what you can do to show how an event has a massive impact in the local area. So we look forward to more of that in the years to come.
I think moving forward, with Internet of Things and smart technologies, I think we can do a lot better on more kind of granular data, more real-time data. So we're always looking to innovate there. And I know we talked about that. Maybe there's kind of non-economic indicators. I suppose like happiness even, or other things that are not so economic based that we can start trying to measure better?
Yeah, it's more socio than economic in ways, but an inclusive growth index is one thing we're looking at, for instance, that kind of captures well-being for people in Dublin, because hard statistics only tell you so much, and I think your Dublin Your Voice was mentioned this morning as an example of that kind of qualitative feedback from citizens on the ground who, okay, we might be looking at full employment and wages increasing, but people have massive issues with cost of living and housing in other areas. So yeah, we're looking at different angles that we can take on that. So again, the monitor is as representative as possible.
Great. And what about the next 10 years? Are you going to be here another?
I don't know about me, but geez, when you look back at the last decade, who would have thought you'd have the UK leaving the European Union? We've had war on the European continent. We've had a pandemic, which was a shocking 2 years. And now we're into a second Trump presidency. That's absolutely wild. I think that's happened in the course of 9 or 10 years. Looking ahead, it's obviously very difficult. I know we have the weather forecaster there who can't even predict next week, but I think looking ahead, the one thing we could say with a relative degree of certainty is that the Dublin population will keep increasing. I think the forecast from the CSO say that there'll be an increase of up to 20% in the Dublin population by 2042, which is absolutely colossal. So that could bring it up from 1.5 to 1.8 million people, and that is huge impacts across the board when you think of government spending on the likes of health, education and welfare, through to infrastructure, housing and so forth. There'll obviously be a massive need to keep investing. And I think to bring it back to the monitor again, that's why it's really important to have the monitor in place, so that people who are making decisions around those really important topics are well informed and have up-to-date data available to them and at their fingertips.
Yeah, and I think we were talking about, like, it seems hard to even predict the next day, let alone the next week, month or year. But one thing for sure with the Economic Monitor is that we'll have the data there so you can see what's happening, and I think that's the key, isn't it, that we're kind of on the pulse in terms of what's happening in the city. And going back to the councillor's comment at the start, evidence-based and data-driven policy is really something that we're really passionate about. So I think that's the key moving forward.
Absolutely, yeah. And I know we're in the kind of in the era of alternative facts and fake news and that sort of thing. So it's all the more reason to have a dedicated source you can go to that is just the pure facts and told without any varnish, essentially. So that's what we're doing. The Dublin Economy website has been mentioned multiple times, but we are looking to spread the word as wide as possible. So we've advertising campaigns running on billboards in different parts of Dublin via Pearl and Dean, our partners, and we're obviously using social media platforms and others to try and get the word out as wide as possible.
Okay, no, that's great. I have my collector's edition of the first Economic Monitor here, so very proud of that. But I reckon you should keep this one. This is going to be another collector's edition in 10 years. But thanks very much for that, Lorcan, and just like to thank Juliet as well, for everything you've done to keep the monitor and grow it, and I suppose expand it over the last couple of years. It's something I'm really excited about. I think the 4 Dublin local authorities are really excited about it. Let's keep it going strong. So thanks everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, Lorcan. Thanks, Jamie, for that look back. And very excited to see what the next 10 years can bring. Our final presentation this morning is from Oliver Clark. He's a European economist with MasterCard. The Dublin Economic Monitor has been tracking MasterCard spending data since the beginning of 2018. And we all see it as a very timely method of measuring the impact of change. It's always very rich. So over to you, Ollie.
Cheers. Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here today. So I'm Ollie, and I'm an economist at the MasterCard Economics Institute. And for those of you that haven't come across the Economics Institute before, we're a team of economists and data scientists that combine traditional macroeconomic research with MasterCard's aggregated and anonymized payments data. We're particularly interested in looking at the economy through the lens of the consumer. So understanding how those trends in the macroeconomy are feeding through to consumer spending decisions. So today I'm going to be talking through the MEI's outlook for European economies, how Ireland fits in within that, and then later on in the presentation I'll be turning towards MasterCard's data to see how we're seeing those economic trends influence Irish spending patterns. To give you a bit of a flavour of the types of analysis that we're able to do at the Economics Institute that just isn't possible with traditional macroeconomic data. On this first slide, we look at how Irish cardholders' spending patterns have changed since 2019. So we've got grocery spending on the left, hair and beauty spending on the right, and we've got the different days of the week across the bottom. So a positive bar tells us that there's an increase in proportion of spend on a particular day of the week, and a negative bar tells us that it's decreasing. And with these two different types of errands that you might run during your week, we can see some broadly similar trends. So we can see these large negative bars on Saturdays, and rather people are shifting their spending earlier in the week. And this might resonate with you a little bit. Perhaps since the pandemic you've started working from home more often, and that's allowed you greater flexibility to maybe go and do a food shop in that time that you previously would have spent commuting. However, it does leave a bit of an open question as to, well, what are Irish cardholders doing with their weekends? And if I add a couple of other categories on here, it becomes clear where Irish cardholders' priorities lie. We can see large increases for restaurant spending on Sundays, and golf has a suspicious spike on Fridays. But this really reflects a global trend that we've seen since the pandemic, which has been the prioritization of experiences. So of course it was very difficult for people to spend time with friends and family during lockdowns, and then as the pandemic eased, there was a real growth in demand for experiences, whether that was going out for meals, going traveling, or going to play a round of golf. Now, I'll come back to some more of these insights using MasterCard data later on, but first I wanted to talk through kind of the MEI outlook for Europe. And of course, the big topic at the minute is on tariffs. So on the left-hand side here, we're looking at the effective tariff rate for different European economies for their exports to the US. And when we're thinking about tariffs, it's useful to put them in two different buckets. So we've got the industry-specific tariffs, notably steel and aluminium, and then automobiles. And then we've got the so-called reciprocal tariffs. And these are generally country-specific, but in the case of the EU, flat tariff rate across all EU countries. We can see that Slovakia kind of stands out with that big blue bar, and that's because Slovakia really specializes in exporting cars, and the tariff rate on cars is pretty high as well, around 25%. And so we get that big bar for Slovakia. You'll notice that Ireland's down at the bottom currently, 2.4% effective tariff rate. And as all of you will know, that's because Ireland really specializes in exporting pharmaceuticals, which are currently excluded from those reciprocal tariffs. However, the Trump administration has announced that it's investigating pharmaceutical tariffs. And in a worst-case scenario, where the threatened 25% tariff is applied, Ireland would shoot up this ranking with an effective tariff rate around 15%. On the right-hand side, we then look to estimate the direct impact of those tariffs on each economy's GDP. You'll notice at the top that we've got Germany, Slovakia, and Sweden. These are all car-producing countries. And the reason that they're at the top is because the tariff rate on cars is quite high, 25%, but also because if a country produces cars, they tend to really like producing cars and really specialize in it. And their economies rely on the export of those cars to create growth. And that's why we see those at the top. But as Andrew touched on earlier, there are lots of other factors in addition to those direct effect on exports that we need to consider. And importantly, there's uncertainty. And it's quite difficult to measure uncertainty, but one way that we can get it is through business and consumer surveys. So on the left-hand side, we've got the change in the PMI, so a type of business survey that's quite closely related to the actual output of businesses. And we could see that Irish businesses have actually been pretty optimistic, as we heard earlier. That's largely driven by service industries, although manufacturing hasn't been too bad either. But then we can see in consumer confidence the change since March 2025. Ireland has the most negative effect, and that makes sense if we think about the kind of national narrative around the connections between the Irish and the US economies, even if that effective tariff rate that we saw on the previous slide isn't super high yet. I also just want to quickly mention the US down at the bottom here. This is not a mistake in the slide. US consumers really are much more optimistic than they were even before the tariff announcements. And what's happened there is that the US consumer confidence took a really big hit in April, but then as Trump pulled back from the worst of the tariffs, US consumers' confidence rebounded, and it rebounded above the level that it was at in March. But I also wanted to flag two reasons why I'm a bit more optimistic about the European economies than I otherwise would be. The first is on fiscal policy, so government tax and spend decisions. Now, different European countries are in very different places in terms of their fiscal position, but the big story at the minute is in Germany, which is here in this chart. Germany falls within this bottom right-hand quadrant, along with Ireland, which shows that it's got a low level of debt and it's got a low deficit, so it's not borrowing much year to year. And with the new chancellor in Germany, there's been an announcement of the release of the debt brake, which will allow the German government to borrow much more and inject a lot of cash into the German economy. Now, a lot of that's going to be spent on defense, but there are also funds that will go towards infrastructure investment, including digital infrastructure. And we're talking about hundreds of billions of euros here, and that could have a significant effect on the German economy and also spread out to the rest of Europe as well. The key issue here is that you can't spend 100 billion euros overnight, and while the tariffs are effective immediately, this fiscal policy change will only start to feed through to the economies in 18 to 24 months. The other factor to be a little bit more optimistic is on interest rates, as we heard. They've been coming down, and we expect one more cut from the ECB before they stabilize at 1.75%. But the key thing to notice here is that interest rates haven't fallen back down to the very low levels that we saw prior to the pandemic. And that gives the ECB some headroom to adjust its interest rates given what happens in tariffs. So if tariffs end up higher than we expect, or if the impact is stronger than we expect, then the ECB can respond and to cut interest rates further and faster, spurring the economies. Now, turning towards the consumer. When we think about the outlook for consumer spending, perhaps the most important thing that we need to consider is the labour market. And on the left-hand side here, we've got a map showing the unemployment rate across the European economies. And the blue colour tells us that the latest unemployment rate is below its long-run historical average. And we can see that's true across most of these economies. However, we are seeing some weakening in most European economies. So while unemployment rates aren't ticking up significantly yet, we are seeing some cooling off in vacancies. That's true in Ireland, but vacancies remain at quite a high level compared to where they were pre-pandemic. If we just quickly look at Germany, we can see that the vacancies rate has fallen much more substantially, and we are seeing a very gradual tick up in unemployment there. However, the big picture is that unemployment remains low, and that allows wages to continue to grow. So the blue dots here show wage growth in the latest data, and we're comparing that to the growth in prices, inflation, on the orange dots. And we can see across these major European economies that wages are growing faster than inflation, so consumer purchasing power is increasing, people have more cash in their pockets to go out and spend. It's a really positive signal for spending over the next 6 to 12 months. But some of you might reasonably be thinking that, well, there was this whole period of time in 2022 where prices were growing faster than inflation, so isn't this just a bit of catch-up? And if we look at the cumulative change over this time, we can see that it was only recently in Ireland that wages caught up with prices, and that's true across most of these major European economies. The exception being Poland, where wage growth has outpaced prices significantly, and there's real huge growth in real wages in Poland. But now turning to the MasterCard data to see how this feeds through to consumer spending decisions. Now on this slide, we're trying to understand how price-sensitive consumers are being. So looking at when consumers go out and spend in a particular category, are they splashing out and going for a more premium product, which would be an arrow to the right-hand side, positive arrow, or are they cutting back and going for a more budget option, which would be an arrow to the left-hand side? In this example, we're looking at apparel spend, and we can see that most European economies, or these major ones shown, are shifting towards those more budget options. And this reflects priorities. We mentioned that experiences are a major priority, and apparel doesn't fall within that. But also the increase in popularity of new online marketplaces that are able to ship very cheap apparel, usually from China, and they're growing in market share. We can see that the exception is Ireland and Spain, both countries that are doing pretty well, so consumers are willing to splash out on these more discretionary products. We can do this across different categories of spending, so restaurant spending, where the more affordable option is fast food restaurants, and the more expensive option is your traditional full-service sit-down meals. Here we can see that across most economies, consumers are shifting towards those fast food restaurants. And again, this reflects changes in the industry as well, so with the increase in popularity of online delivery services, eating up some of that market share from traditional restaurants. But again, not much prioritization of going out for food. Where we are seeing some prioritization of splashing out is in travel. So here, the more affordable option is travel within Europe, and the more expensive option is travel further afield outside of Europe. And we can see that travel is an area where European consumers are really prioritizing, with most European countries shifting towards that more expensive international travel. The exception being Spain, where consumers are prioritizing apparel, and the UK, where they were shifting towards more restaurants. We can also look at tourism within an island itself, and here we look at how different tourists from different origin countries like to spend when they come to Ireland. We can see that US tourists spend the most in hotels. Italians, famed for their delicious cuisine, like to sample the Irish delicacies with the highest proportion of spend in restaurants. And it's French tourists that top the charts in terms of spend in bars and nightclubs. But sometimes we want to do some more granular analysis. We want to look at kind of specific localized spending. And that's where our synthetic control analysis comes in. So this is a type of causal analysis where we look to estimate the effect of a particular event on spending in a local area. We do that by estimating an alternative universe where the event didn't take place, and then looking at the difference between what actually happened and our estimate, and that gives us a figure of the increase. This uses two strengths of MasterCard's data. One, that we're a very established company, so we have a long time series of data that allows us to make accurate predictions for that alternative universe. But also the fact that we are a very international company, so that allows us to understand cross-border spending, tourist spending, in much more detail than a lot of other companies. This example that I've got here looks at Taylor Swift's Eras Tour and the effect on spending around Wembley when it occurred. And we can see that restaurant and hotel spending increased significantly, but the real story is in cross-border spending, where we see much larger increases. And this is important for governments that want to understand the effect on GDP, because this is telling us that Taylor Swift's tour was able to attract tourists into the UK, boosting GDP, rather than just shifting spending from, say, South London to North London. So let me leave you with three key takeaways. The first is on that tariff uncertainty. So tariffs are likely to weigh on growth, but I gave two reasons to be a bit more optimistic about the European economies. So there's that government spending in Germany, which could provide a boost, and also the potential for interest rates to fall further and faster if needed. The key consideration here is on timing, where tariffs are effective immediately, whereas these policy changes will take kind of 18 to 24 months to feed through. So there might be a period of difficulty in the meantime. The second point is that the consumer's pretty solid in Europe, with low unemployment and pretty strong wage growth, both of which are a pretty strong signal for consumer spending over the next 6 to 12 months. And then finally, we saw that price sensitivity of European consumers, with different countries prioritizing different types of spending. So while most countries were willing to splash out on travel, in Spain they were prioritizing apparel spend, and in the UK it was restaurants. So I hope you found this interesting, and I'll thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Ollie. That was fascinating, and it really shows the power of granular data and what kind of story it can tell. So that just leaves it to me now to thank everybody involved in the event today, and in particular the staff here at the gorgeous Hugh Lane, who have been really, really flexible and helpful with everything. And then to hand over to Anne-Marie Farrelly, who's the Chief Executive of Fingal County Council, just to close proceedings. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Delighted to be here. I'm representing my colleagues in Dublin City Council, Richard, in South Dublin Column, and Dunleary Rathdown, Frank. I think it's the first time I've addressed the Dublin Economic Monitor in the 10 years, so delighted to do so on the anniversary. Thank you to Councillor Horner for welcoming us today. I'm very proud to be here in the Hugh Lane Gallery. It's a fashionable townhouse that dates back to 1775. It became the official municipal gallery of modern art in 1929 and renamed to honour Hugh Lane back in 1975. In the 18th century, this house was built with social gatherings in mind, and I can see why. So it's really fitting to have this celebratory event here this morning. I mentioned I'm representing my colleagues across Dublin. This is a collaboration. It's between the 4 Dublin local authorities, but our partners in Grant Thornton and Pact House are also key partners and instrumental in the success of the Monitor over the 10 years. I suppose listening to Ollie, I realise why so many of my phone calls go unanswered on a Friday afternoon. But I suppose looking at the Monitor and seeing the economic trends, just to mention a couple of things, I suppose in terms of housing is probably the priority for the Dublin Chief Executives. It's what we work on day in, day out. But just to mention in the case of Fingal, there were 3 times the level of commencements last year than we would have expected. There's a lot of government initiatives that led to that trend. So I suppose they will wash through in terms of completions this year and next. So at least where you see the commencements taking such a huge dip in 2025, there is some hope in terms of the level of commencements that were notified to us last year. But again, a lot more to do. I see in terms of the summary of the publication today, you know, the acknowledgement that housing and infrastructure being the key priorities for the delivery of infrastructure for Dublin in the coming years. I couldn't agree more. There's a big expectation from the National Development Plan. We need to see what that will contain, and we need to understand the art of the possible, what can happen, what housing can be delivered, and to make sure that we work across our partners to make sure the right things are done and to activate as many sites as possible. We've worked hard on that in Fingal, and we have a good collaborative process with the private sector to deliver housing. We have a very advanced development agreement where we work with the private sector to deliver public housing, social and affordable housing, and private sector housing as well, bringing private money into public sites to deliver at scale, usually of the order of 1,000 or 1,200 units. More to be done in that space, but just to give you some hope. We talk about tariffs and Trump, and of course, I'll just give you a bit of an anecdote I heard from a potato farmer in North Dublin, Kyo's Crisps, winner of a recognition award of the National Enterprise Awards recently. So I was sitting beside him, I said, how are you getting on with the tariffs? He said, I've sorted all those deals out yesterday. He says, so continuing to trade in the US, but priority for the next number of months will be to get new markets in Canada. What about the US? Will you grow there? Yes, major top-end supermarket from the United States visited my farm in Ballybohol yesterday. Brought them on a tour of our potato fields, showed them the factory, and hopeful of a new contract there. So I suppose why I say that is just the art of the possible, and to make sure that we give that positive message to our businesses, that we will support them in any way we can to continue to trade successfully, and the benefit of a Dublin Economic Monitor to allow them to understand the trends and to adjust and do whatever they need to do to safeguard their business is, I suppose, one of the reasons the Dublin local authorities wanted this monitor to be in place. So again, thanks to Grant Thornton and to Andrew and Lorcan for their work over the 10 years. It's really helped the success of Dublin and the Eastern region. The partnership goes beyond those I've just mentioned. The likes of MasterCard, of course, the NTA, Dublin Airport and the CSO, that's just a few that help us in producing the data each quarter. To give the shout out to the Dublin Economy.ie website, to Andrew's point earlier, we want you all to use it and help your own business in understanding what the data is telling us. The Dublin economy has been resilient over the last 10 years. We have faced major challenges. We've come through the pandemic, the working from home, the Dublin city centre impacts of that, etc. But again, as Andrew mentioned, that uncertainty of the US hitting us now. The US is a major trading partner of Dublin. Approximately 30% of Irish goods exports go there. I've given you the Kyo example, but it's not to understate the challenge that we face. The Dublin Economic Monitor will track the impact of these developments, and hopefully there'll be some positive ones coming through as well in the coming years. Spending data do pick up early signs of any changes in the domestic economy. In hotel and the airport data, of course, will highlight trends in tourism patterns, and the FDI indicator will help track the impact on investment. I look forward to seeing how the Dublin economy deals with these new challenges, but more than that, I think we need to understand the impact of the challenges and adjust and make changes to how we do our business to try and address the negative impact. That just leaves me to thank the Hugh Lane Gallery for hosting us today. It's a beautiful venue. I think we'll all be attracted to it in the future. And thank you for such a good attendance on an early morning in June. You're very welcome, and I'm really happy that you continue to be interested and engaged in the Dublin Economic Monitor. Thanks, everybody.